A chariot maker in ancient Babylon becomes the richest man in the city by following 7 simple rules about money. Here's what's strange. These same rules work today, word for word, despite being written nearly a century ago about events from 4,000 years ago. The mathematics of wealth apparently don't change much. Clay tablets, stock portfolios, same principles. George Clason figured this out in the 1920s when he started writing these parables for banks and insurance companies. The richest man in Babylon has something to teach us about being the richest person in our own neighborhood. 4 big ideas from this book. 1. Coffee. Let's pour. First, the cure for a lean purse that every working person can apply immediately. Second, the 5 laws of gold that determine whether money stays with you or leaves you. Third, why the walls of Babylon matter more than you think for your financial future. Fourth, the slave who understood something about debt that his master didn't. There's this moment in ancient Babylon where Arcad, who's become the richest man in the entire city, sits down with his childhood friends Bansir and Kabi. These two are broke, frustrated, wondering why their old friend has all the gold while they're still scraping by. So they ask him directly, "What's your secret?" And Arcad tells them something that stops them cold. He says he started with absolutely nothing, just like them, but he learned one simple rule from an old moneylender named Algamish. Keep 1/10 of everything you earn, no matter what. 1/10, not half, not some massive sacrifice that would leave you eating scraps. Just 10% of every coin that passes through your hands you keep. Arcad explains that when he first heard this advice, he thought it was too simple, almost insulting. But he tried it anyway. Every time he earned 10 coins, he put one aside before spending anything else, before paying the baker, before buying new sandals, before anything. That 1 coin went into a separate pouch, and it stayed there. The friends are skeptical, naturally. 10% doesn't sound like much when you're already struggling to make ends meet. But Arcad walks them through the math. If you earn 100 pieces of silver in a year and save 10, you have 10 pieces working for you. If you can make those 10 pieces earn even a small return, you have more than 10 pieces the next year. And the year after that, you're saving 10% of a larger income, plus earning returns on a growing pile of money. It compounds, slowly at first, then faster. What Arcad discovered, and what his friends are just beginning to grasp, is that wealth isn't about earning more money, it's about keeping some of what you earn. This seems obvious when you hear it, but most people live their entire lives without ever grasping this distinction. They think the solution to money problems is always more income, a better job, a raise, a windfall. But Arcad started as a simple scribe, earning no more than his friends. The difference was that he learned to pay himself first. This is the cure for what Clason calls a lean purse. That chronic condition where your money disappears as fast as it arrives, where you feel like you're working hard but getting nowhere financially. The cure isn't complicated financial instruments or get-rich-quick schemes. It's the discipline of setting aside 1/10 of your income before you spend anything else. Now, sitting here with my coffee, thinking about how this applies to our world today, I realize the mechanics are exactly the same, even though the context has changed completely. We don't deal in pieces of silver or gold coins, but the principle translates perfectly to direct deposit and automatic transfers. You can set up your bank account so that 10% of every paycheck moves immediately into a separate savings account before you even see it. Before the mortgage payment, before groceries, before the streaming services and coffee shop visits. The beauty of this approach is that it forces you to live on 90% of your income from day one. Most people do the opposite. They spend everything they earn, then try to save whatever's left over at the end of the month. There's never anything left over. But when you flip this sequence, when you save first and spend second, you discover something remarkable. You can live on less than you thought. You adjust. You find efficiencies. You distinguish between what you want and what you actually need. I've watched people implement this simple system, and the psychological shift is as important as the financial one. When you have money that's growing separate from your daily expenses, you start thinking differently about purchases. You become more conscious about where your money goes because you're already committed to a specific savings rate. You're not trying to save more, you're trying to live well on what remains. The compound effect that Arcad described to his friends works exactly the same way with modern investment accounts. That 10%, invested consistently in index funds or other vehicles, grows not just from your contributions but from the returns on previous contributions. Start this at 25, and by retirement you're looking at substantial wealth built from what seemed like modest sacrifices. But here's what strikes me as the deeper insight. This isn't really about the money itself. It's about developing the capacity to delay gratification, to think beyond immediate desires, to build something systematically over time. These are the mental muscles that create success in any area of life. Ask yourself, if you automatically saved 10% of your income starting with your very next paycheck, what would you have to give up, and would you actually miss it 6 months from now? Arcad's son Namasir stood before his father with empty hands and a heavy heart. The richest man in Babylon had given his son a bag of gold and a clay tablet inscribed with 5 laws, then sent him into the world to learn wisdom. 10 years later, Namasir returned with nothing but the tablet. The gold was gone, twice over actually. He'd lost the first inheritance through foolish investments and trusting the wrong people. Then he'd earned it back through honest labor, only to lose it again by ignoring those same 5 laws his father had given him. But something had shifted in those final years. Namasir began treating those laws not as his father's old-fashioned advice, but as immutable principles that govern how wealth actually behaves. He started small, saving copper coins instead of gold talents, but applying the laws religiously. The money began to stick. It began to grow. By the time he stood before Arcad again, he understood why his father had let him fail twice. The laws weren't suggestions. They were the operating system of money itself. The 5 laws of gold that Arcad inscribed on that tablet reveal something profound about wealth that most people spend their entire lives fighting against. Gold, Arcad explained, comes gladly to those who understand its nature, but it flees from those who try to force it into unnatural patterns. The first law says gold comes gladly, and in increasing quantity to any person who will put by not less than 1/10 of their earnings to create an estate for their future. Not 9% when times are good, not 11% when you feel generous. 1/10, consistently, as a non-negotiable tribute to your future self. The second law reveals that gold labors diligently and contentedly for the wise owner who finds for it profitable employment. Money isn't meant to sit idle. It wants to work, but only in ventures that preserve the principle while generating returns. The third law warns that gold clings to the protection of the cautious owner who invests it under the advice of men wise in its handling. This isn't about being timid. It's about recognizing that money has its own logic, and that logic is best understood by people who have successfully navigated it for years. The fourth law states that gold slips away from the man who invests it in businesses or purposes with which he is not familiar or which are not approved by those skilled in its keep. Namasir learned this one the hard way, twice. Every get-rich-quick scheme, every investment that promises returns too good to be true, every venture that asks you to trust rather than understand violates this law. The fifth law is perhaps the most brutal. Gold flees the man who would force it to impossible earnings, or who follows the alluring advice of tricksters and schemers. These aren't just ancient principles for ancient times. They're playing out in your financial life right now, whether you recognize them or not. That automatic transfer you set up to move money into savings before you can spend it. That's the first law in action. The index fund that quietly compounds your contributions year after year without drama or excitement. That's the second law working for you. The financial advisor who talks you out of putting your retirement money into cryptocurrency or your brother-in-law's restaurant venture. That's the third and fourth laws protecting you from yourself. But here's what's interesting about these laws. They're not really about money at all. They're about human nature. Namasir didn't fail because he was unlucky or because the economy was bad. He failed because he treated money like it should bend to his desires instead of learning to work with its natural patterns. He wanted shortcuts and exceptions in special cases. The laws don't care about your intentions or your circumstances or how badly you need the money to behave differently than it does. Most people approach their finances like they're negotiating with money, trying to convince it to stick around despite their habits, or grow despite their impatience, or multiply despite their ignorance. But money doesn't negotiate. It simply responds to the conditions you create for it. Create conditions of discipline, patience, and wisdom, and it flows toward you. Create conditions of impulsiveness, greed, and wishful thinking, and it flows away from you with the same mechanical certainty that water flows downhill. The remarkable thing about Namasir's story is that the same laws that governed his failures also governed his eventual success. Nothing changed except his relationship to the laws themselves. He stopped fighting them and started following them. The gold that had fled from him as a young man came gladly to him as a mature man, not because he was different, but because he finally understood that the laws were different from suggestions. Ask yourself, which of your current money habits are you hoping will be the exception to these ancient laws? Picture this scene from ancient Babylon. The city is under siege. Enemy armies have surrounded the walls, cutting off trade routes and supplies. Inside the city, panic should be spreading through the streets, but something remarkable happens instead. The citizens of Babylon remain calm, almost confident. They go about their daily business while arrows fly overhead and battering rams pound at their gates. Why? Because they understand something their enemies don't. Those massive walls aren't just keeping invaders out. They're protecting something far more valuable than gold or jewels. They're protecting the financial security that every citizen has built within those walls. You see, the Babylonians had learned to save a portion of everything they earned. Not just the wealthy merchants or the royal family, but the bakers, the craftsmen, the farmers who sold their goods in the marketplace. Each had accumulated what they called their treasure, their savings that grew month after month, year after year. When the siege began, they didn't panic about where their next meal would come from or how they'd survive without trade income. They had resources set aside. Their walls weren't just made of stone and mortar. They were made of financial discipline and foresight. The siege dragged on for weeks, then months. The enemy expected the city to surrender when food ran low and desperation set in. Instead, they found themselves facing a population that had prepared for exactly this kind of crisis. The citizens had enough stored wealth to buy food from their reserves, to maintain their households, to even continue some forms of commerce within the protected city. The walls that kept the enemies out also kept their financial security in. This is what Clason calls building your own walls of protection, creating a financial fortress that can withstand the sieges that life inevitably brings. Because modern life throws plenty of sieges our way, doesn't it? The unexpected medical bill that arrives like a battering ram at your budget. The job loss that cuts off your income like those blocked trade routes. The car repair, the home emergency, the family crisis that demands immediate resources. Most people face these situations the way an unprotected city faces an army, with panic, scrambling, and often defeat. But here's what the Babylonians understood that we often miss. Financial security isn't about earning more money, though that helps. It's about building walls, systematic, deliberate barriers between you and financial catastrophe. The most fundamental wall is what they called paying yourself first. Before the tax collector, before the merchant, before anyone else gets paid from your earnings, you pay yourself. You take a portion. They recommended a tenth, but even a 20th will start building your wall, and you set it aside as your treasure. Think about your own financial walls right now. If an enemy army surrounded your life today, say, your company announced layoffs, or your largest expense suddenly doubled, how long could you hold out? Most Americans, according to recent surveys, couldn't handle a $400 emergency without borrowing money or selling something. That's like having a city with no walls at all. Every small attack becomes a potential disaster. Building these walls requires the same patience the Babylonians used to build their physical walls. Stone by stone, month by month, setting aside that portion of your income even when it feels insignificant. especially when it feels insignificant. Because here's the thing about walls, they're not built in a day, and their strength comes from consistency, not from grand gestures. $100 saved every month for 5 years creates a more solid wall than $1,000 saved once and then forgotten. The beauty of financial walls is that they don't just protect you during crises. They change how you move through the world. When you know you have resources set aside, you make different decisions. You're less likely to stay in a job you hate just because you need the paycheck. You're more likely to take calculated risks, to invest in yourself, to help others when they're under siege. Your walls don't just keep trouble out, they keep opportunities in. The Babylonians also understood that walls need maintenance. You don't build your emergency fund once and forget about it. You keep adding to it, reinforcing it, making sure it grows stronger over time. And like those ancient walls, your financial walls should be high enough and thick enough to withstand not just small raids, but major sieges. 3 months of expenses is a good start. 6 months is better. A year gives you the kind of confidence those Babylonian citizens felt when they watched their enemies camp outside, knowing they were the ones who were truly protected. Ask yourself, what kind of siege is your current financial situation prepared to withstand? Picture this scene from ancient Babylon. Megiddo, a slave, sits across from his master who's drowning in debt. The master owes money to half the merchants in the city and can't see a way out. He's considering fleeing Babylon entirely, abandoning his debts and starting fresh somewhere else. But Megiddo, this slave who owns nothing, looks at his master and says something that cuts right to the heart of what separates free men from slaves in their thinking. "Master," Megiddo says, "you speak of the soul of a free man, but I see in you the soul of a slave." The master is stunned. Here's his own slave telling him he thinks like a slave. Megiddo continues, "A free man honors his debts. A slave runs from them. You were not born a slave, yet you would act like one." Megiddo then tells his master about his own past. He had once been free, a successful man with a thriving business. But he made poor decisions, borrowed heavily, and when his ventures failed, he owed enormous sums. Faced with the same choice his master now faces, Megiddo chose to stay and face his creditors. He sold everything he owned, including his freedom, to pay what he could. He became a slave not to escape his debts, but to honor them. "I may wear the chains of a slave," Megiddo explains, "but in my heart I am free because I faced my obligations. You wear no chains, yet you think like a slave because you would run from yours." The master is shaken by this wisdom. Here's a man who literally sold himself into slavery to maintain his integrity, teaching him about true freedom. Megiddo goes on to explain that debts are not just about money. They're about who you are as a person. When you borrow, you're making a promise. When you repay, you're keeping that promise. When you run, you're breaking something fundamental about your character. This story reveals something profound about how we handle our obligations and what that says about our character. Megiddo understood that true freedom isn't about avoiding consequences or running from difficulties. It's about facing them with integrity intact. The slave had something his master had lost sight of: the understanding that your word is more valuable than your comfort, that your character is more important than your immediate circumstances. In our modern world, we face this same choice constantly, though perhaps not as dramatically as Megiddo's master. We live in a culture that often encourages us to take the easy way out, declare bankruptcy instead of working through debt, walk away from underwater mortgages, default on student loans, move to a new city when relationships get complicated, change jobs when work gets challenging. The mechanisms are different, but the underlying choice is the same. Do we face our obligations or do we run? I'm not talking about legitimate situations where bankruptcy or other legal protections serve their proper purpose. I'm talking about the everyday moments where we choose between the hard path of honoring our commitments and the easier path of finding an escape hatch. When we've promised to help a friend move and something more fun comes up. When we've committed to a project at work but lose enthusiasm when it gets difficult. When we've borrowed money from family and could probably get away with not paying it back because they're too polite to ask. The principle Megiddo understood is that these choices accumulate. Each time we choose the easy escape over the difficult honor, we're training ourselves to think like slaves to our circumstances rather than free people who control their responses to circumstances. We're teaching ourselves that our word is negotiable, that our commitments are suggestions, that our character is less important than our convenience. The most successful people I know, the ones who sleep well at night, have internalized Megiddo's wisdom. They understand that facing obligations head-on, even when it's difficult, builds something valuable inside them. It builds the kind of character that others trust, that they themselves can rely on, that creates genuine freedom rather than the illusion of freedom that comes from running away. This doesn't mean being rigid or never renegotiating terms when circumstances genuinely change. It means approaching our obligations with the soul of a free person rather than the soul of a slave. It means seeing our debts, our promises, our commitments as opportunities to demonstrate who we are rather than burdens to escape from. Megiddo's master eventually took his slave's advice, stayed in Babylon, and worked out payment plans with his creditors. The story suggests he found not only financial recovery but something more valuable, self-respect and the respect of others. He learned to think like a free man again. Ask yourself, what obligation are you currently tempted to run from instead of face with integrity? I just finished George Clason's Ancient Wisdom wrapped in Babylonian parables, and 4 ideas keep circling back. First, the cure for a lean purse isn't complicated. Save 1/10 of everything you earn. No exceptions, no negotiations with yourself. Second, the 5 laws of gold reveal money's predictable nature. It flees from those who invest foolishly, but multiplies for those who put it to work in ventures they understand. Third, the walls of Babylon weren't just stone and mortar. They were insurance against disaster, protection that let prosperity flourish inside. Fourth, the slave's wisdom cuts deepest. Where determination goes, a way opens, and your current circumstances don't define your future possibilities. These aren't revolutionary concepts, but Clason understood something we forget: simple truths told through stories stick better than complex theories written in textbooks. Open a separate savings account today and set up an automatic transfer of 10% of your income to move there every payday. Not 9% when times are tight, not 11% when you feel generous. Exactly 10% automatically before you can spend it on anything else. This removes the daily decision fatigue and makes saving as predictable as paying rent. That's one book, one coffee. Next coffee, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant.